Hello, I'm Neil Hamilton, a professor of law at Drake University in Des Moines and director of the Agricultural Law Center. I want to welcome you to another installment in our series, Law for Landowners, 10 Things You Should Understand. Today our topic is 10 questions that prospective buyers of farmland should ask. If you are interested in buying farmland, it's really your obligation to do due diligence, to learn as much as you can about the property. One of the best ways you can do that is by considering a series of questions to think about, the type of information that you should know about a property before you bid on it or purchase it. The goal of trying to get answers to these questions is to avoid surprises and to make sure you know what you're obtaining. This is especially important since you're going to be spending your hard-earned money to obtain the property. And you want to make sure that you're actually buying what you think you're buying and that you're not inviting or buying an invitation to a legal problem. The first point to consider is understanding how large the property is that you're purchasing. Property can be described in many different ways. Tillable acres, actual acres, taxable acres, and so understanding how large the tract is and which terms are being used is important to understanding what may be actually being sold. It's important to recognize that oftentimes legal descriptions will list an acreage number then followed by M/L, which means more or less. Second point to consider is if you're buying farmland, then the history of that property participating in the federal farm programs is very important in terms of its value. Knowing what the crop base is, and knowing the acres that are involved. And so it's important that you obtain from the local USDA office those records. And if you can't obtain them directly, that you ask the potential seller to authorize the release of that information. If for some reason people aren't willing to share those records with you, you should be cautious and be concerned about why that might be. A third and related point to understand is what is the conservation plan for the property and what's its conservation history. For example, are there wetlands on the property? Is there a conservation plan with the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is the local agency, or with the County Soil and Water Conservation District? Understanding how the land's been farmed and what the plans are for its conservation are an important part of understanding its potential use. A fourth and related point would be understanding whether or not there may be any existing USDA contracts for the property. For example, is any of the land currently enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program? Or is there an existing EQIP? What's the Environmental Quality Incentives Program contract existing? If these exist for the property, you as the potential purchaser may well be subject to the obligations. And so understanding what's going on the property, particularly as it relates to these important government programs, is a key part of understanding the potential transaction. A fifth issue that relates to the conservation history of the property is knowing whether or not any public cost-sharing funds have been used. For example, have there been terraces constructed? Have there been wetlands installed? Are there other activities that have happened on the property that have been paid for in part using state or federal money? If there have been, then it's important to recognize that there may be a continuing obligation to maintain those practices for their useful life. A sixth point to understand is to recognize what are the current boundaries of the property. It's important that you be able to get out onto the land and actually walk it. To see where the boundaries are, to understand how large it is, and to see how the property is being farmed and what the current natural condition is. A seventh and related point is to understand whether or not there are any water courses, any streams that run through it. Are there ponds? Are there other natural features like that that may either impact how you can use the property or that may have associated with them certain obligations on your part? An eighth point to consider is what's the current nature of the fences? Do fences exist in terms of the partition between the neighbors, or have they been removed? Are there internal fences? For example, if you're considering using livestock on the property. Are there road fences, fences between the property and the ditches? And so understanding both the fences, which gives you a sense of whether there may be potential conflicts with neighboring owners, as well as whether or not there may be some uncertainty as to exactly where the boundaries are between the neighbors if in fact the fences have been removed. A ninth point to consider about any piece of property is thinking about who the neighbors are and what the uses of those properties are. If you're thinking about farm property and the neighboring land is being used for farming, well, there may not be many worries. But for example, if you were buying a piece of farmland that was adjacent to a residential development, or was land that was clearly being put to some other use or was potentially changing, that's certainly a factor to consider because things are going to be different in the years ahead. A 10th and final point to think about is whether or not there might be any existing agreements with the neighbors. For example, have they entered into an agreement on how the drainage is going to be handled? Is there an agreement that allocates who's responsible for maintaining the fences? And so trying to understand what else may exist, particularly as it relates to those neighboring properties, is important to understand what you may be obtaining with this piece of property. So the point to consider is that as a potential purchaser of property, it's really your obligation to find out as much as you can, to answer the types of questions you can. And by following the type of questions that we've laid out here, you can go a long way in both avoiding surprises and being sure you're getting what you hope to pay for.